Hey everyone, welcome to a new video of Rollercoaster Tycoon 2 Explained. In this video I will explain how guest spawning works. This information should be really useful if you like to play the scenarios, and should make it easier for you to beat them. Knowing how guest spawning works should also be really useful if you want to do any speedruns in this game. Now let's begin the explanation. The first thing the function for guest generation does is calculate the suggested guest maximum. Every ride type has a value called ride bonus value. In the description I will put a link to a file which has the bonus values for every ride type. For the corkscrew coaster, for example, the ride bonus value is 100, and for the giga coaster this value is 120. The function simply adds these values together. So if you build a corkscrew coaster and a giga coaster, your suggested guest maximum will be 220. After this, the game will calculate a guest spawning probability. You start with the probability value of 50. The function then takes the park rating and subtracts 200 from it. The value of this subtraction will be limited to a number between 0 and 650 and then added to your probability value. So if your park rating was lower than 200, your probability value would now be 50. If your park rating was higher than 850, your probability value would now be 700. After this, the game counts the number of guests in the park and the number of guests heading to the park and adds those together. If this number is higher than the suggested guest maximum calculated in the first step, the spawning probability gets divided by 4. When this is done, the function will check the entrance price of all rides and subtracts that from their value. If the entrance fee of the park is higher than the value of all rides minus their price, the spawning probability gets divided by 4. If the entrance fee of the park is twice as high as the value minus the price for all rides, the probability again gets divided by 4, so only very little will remain. After this, the function will check for any awards that are active. Every positive award that is active will increase the spawning probability value by 25%. Every negative award will decrease the probability value by 25%. If you have 3 positive awards active, your probability value gets multiplied by 1.25 times 1.25 times 1.25, which is almost twice as much as the original value. The probability value that results from these calculations is used in a later function to generate guests. Before I explain that, I want to first discuss something else. Now, when you make a scenario, there's an option to select more difficult guest generation. If this option is selected, the formulas for calculating the spawning probability value will be a little bit different. Some of the original scenarios also have this option ticked. Now, if the more difficult guest generation option is checked, the game also uses the ride bonus value to calculate the suggested guest maximum. But this function will only work up to 1000 guests, however. So after this, the game will check all tracked rides, and every tracked ride that's over 600 meters long and has an excitement rating of over 6 has its ride's bonus value applied again, twice. So if you build 15 corkscrew coasters in your park, which all meet the length requirement of 600 meters, and which all have an excitement rating of at least 6, the suggested guest maximum would be 1000 from the normal function, and then plus 15 times 100 times 2 from the second function, which gives us a value of 4000. If a scenario has the option for more difficult guest generation enabled, you should really aim for making tracked rides that meet the length and excitement requirements. The second change in these scenarios is that if the number of guests in the park and heading to the park is higher than the suggested guest maximum, the probability value gets divided by 16, which makes the value very low. If the number of guests is more than 150 guests above the suggested guest maximum in these scenarios, no guests will be spawned through the normal spawn function at all. Alright, now that we know how the probability value gets calculated for these two different types of scenarios, let's see how the game uses these values to generate guests. Now, Rollercoaster Tycoon 2 runs at 40 ticks per second. The game generates a random number from 0 to 65,635 in every tick. When the generated number is lower than the probability value calculated earlier, a guest will be spawned. Now, in an earlier video I explained how advertisements work and how they spawn guests. Guest spawning from advertisements is handled in a separate function. So even if the normal spawning algorithm doesn't spawn guests anymore, advertisement campaigns can still spawn guests. I recommend you to watch that video if you want to know how advertisement campaigns work. Anyway, this was probably a lot of information, so I will now give some tips and tricks to maximize the number of guests that spawn. In a normal scenario, you should spam as many small and cheap roller coasters as possible. A 3-tile corkscrew coaster will raise the suggested guest maximum as much as a corkscrew coaster that covers half of the map. In a scenario with more difficult guest generation, you should build your roller coasters with a length of at least 600 meters and an excitement rating of at least 6. In all scenarios, you should keep your park rating above 850 to maximize the spawn rate. Positive awards will also temporarily increase your guest spawn rate. And of course, advertisements are also a great way to spawn many extra guests. Now, there's one limit to the guest generation that I did not cover yet, which is the sprite limit. You can have a maximum of around 9600 sprites in the game, which includes roller coaster trains, guests, ducks and balloons. If you have more than this amount, no more guests will spawn, not even from advertisement campaigns. Anyway, that was all the information I have on guest spawning in Rollercoaster Tycoon 2. This information can also be found in a written guide, which I have linked in the description. I hope this guide was useful to you, and I will see you again in the next video. See you later!